Hello everyone, and welcome to Problem of the Week number 4. Woo! Super happy that you're continuing to do these problems. I know they can be tricky, so keep up all your hard work. Sometimes you're going to get it, sometimes you aren't. And remember, if you ever need support, please reach out and I'll help you out. So this time around, we are working with parts of the whole and equivalent fractions. Some were a little more difficult than the others, but I like the way they rolled these questions out because they kind of built on your skills from one question to the next. So on the first question, we have a grid divided into 24 squares. Here we are here. You're going to follow the steps to doodle in some of the squares. Read the steps carefully and do them in order that they are given. No square can have more than one doodle in it. So what we were asked to do first was to draw a smiley face in 1/4 of the squares. Now, when we start doing this, you have to understand that 1/4 has to relate to the whole now of 24. So what we need to do is focus on equivalent fractions. So how do I get from 1/4 to now a fraction that has 24 as its denominator, because 24 is our new whole. So what we're going to do is figure out how many times 4 fits into our new whole of 24. And we know that we have to multiply 4 by 6 to get to 24. So we've got to remember, whatever we do to the bottom, we do to the top. So that gives us a fraction of 6/24. So when they say 1/4 of the squares are filled with a happy face, the way I can relate that to a grid of 24 squares is to create the equivalent fraction. So the equivalent fraction here is 6 out of 24. So I got to put a happy face in 6 of these squares here. And what we're going to end up doing is following that exact same set of steps for the rest of the pictures that they want us to put in. So the next one is 1/6 of remaining blank squares are to have a cloud. Now the key word there is the remaining squares. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18 squares left. So 18 is our new total. So what we have to do is create an equivalent fraction for 1/6 that has 18 as its denominator, because that is our new total. So what I have to do is multiply 6 by 3, which gives me 18. Whatever I do to the bottom, I do to the top, and I get a fraction of 3/18. So that suggests that I have to draw a cloud into 3 of the squares. Pretty crummy clouds, but it's the morning, and my drawing skills aren't up to snuff. Now on to the spiral. So the spiral is in 2/5 of the remaining squares. So we have 15 remaining squares. So that is our new total. So how do I get from 5 to 15? Well, I have to multiply 5 by 3. Whatever I do to the bottom, I obviously have to do to the top, which leaves me with a fraction of 6/15. So I'm going to have a spiral in 6 of the remaining blank squares. It's 4, 5, and 6. And then the last fraction we're given is 1/3 of what's remaining has wavy lines. So we have 9 squares left. So 9 is our new total. So how do we get from 3 to 9? We have to multiply 3 by 3, gives us 9. Whatever we do to the bottom, we do to the top. So 1 times 3 is 3. So 3 out of the 9 remaining squares are going to have wavy lines. 1, 2, 3. And it leaves us with 6 blank, as it mentioned in the question. Okay, so that's it for the first question. Moving on to problem 2. Problem 2 is tricky. So I'm going to do my best to explain. It might be a little bit all over the place, but just try and follow along. So Shreya, I think I'm saying her name right, Shreya started with a different blank grid. and was given similar instructions as to those given in problem 1. Shreya was given one instruction for drawing each of the same 4 shapes, but the fractions in Shreya's instructions may have been different, and the order in which Shreya was asked to draw the shapes may have been different. Shreya ended up with, so this is basically what they're saying is the order in which we do things might be a little bit different. But this next statement is where things get important. So I've recorded them here. Shreya ended up with 6 squares with wavy lines, 4 squares with spirals, 5 squares with clouds, 10 squares with happy faces, and 5 blank squares. We cannot be sure of exactly what list of instructions Shreya was given. Can you give one possibility for the list of instructions that Shreya could have been working from? To start, determine the total number of squares in the grid. So that's where I started. So here's what I know. I know that these numbers here represent how many of the squares are filled. So if I were to add everything up, I am left with 30 squares. And that's kind of how I started things out. And then I went back to what I knew about equivalent fractions. And I started using my knowledge of equivalent fractions to start to fill this in. So we start with our 6 squares of wavy lines. So the fraction I can create right now is based on a total of 30 because I have 30 blank squares. So I'm going to have a fraction of 6 out of 30. And then I want to reduce that fraction to end up with 1/5. And then I can color in, or draw in rather, my wavy lines into 6 of the 30 blank squares. The second one was 4 spirals. So I am only left now with 24 squares. That's my new total of blank squares. So my fraction here would be 4 out of 24. And I want to reduce it to a fraction of 1/6. And I want to color in my squares with those spirals. So I know 4 of those squares are going to have spirals. And then I want to move on to my clouds. So I know 5 of those squares are going to have clouds in them. And I want to create a fraction of what's remaining. So there's 20 squares left. So that gives me 5 out of 20, or a reduced fraction of 1/4. So I'm going to fill in 5 squares with the cloud. And then I'm on to my happy face here, and 10 of the remaining squares. So I have 15 remaining squares. So 10 out of 15 is a reduced fraction of 2/3 of my total. We'll have happy faces. So I got to draw a lot of happy faces, 10 of them to be precise. And what I'm left with is 5 blank squares. So the question asks for a possibility of the order in which the list was given. So I just followed the list that Shreya had kind of followed when she did it. And I just followed the sequence straight from the question. And you can see right away that when I completed it, everything ended up fitting in. So to me, that was one way you could solve that problem. Now moving on to problem number 3. And problem number 3, Arian was given a grid of blank squares and the following instructions. In order. So draw a cloud in 1/4 of the squares. I'm going to write that down here. So 1/4 has to be a cloud. A spiral in 1/6 of the squares, and a smiley face in 2/5 of the squares. And after following all the steps, Arian ended up with 6 blank squares. So that's a very important part here, because the 6 squares is going to help us determine what is the right total amount of squares to begin with. So I kind of based it off what we had done already. Like, for example, the one up here that we just finished, problem number 2, well, we were left over with 5 blank, and we started with a total of 30. So I thought, well, I'm going to start with 32. It was just kind of a lucky guess to start with. But I wanted to start with a number that seemed, I don't know, reasonable. So when I started filling these in, so I'm going to use a marker. I'm not going to draw things in. I'm just going to highlight squares that I use. So I just did this one quickly. I didn't do all the calculations, but I just started drawing or kind of highlighting squares. So I knew that 1/4 of the squares had to be a cloud. So that would end up being 8 of the total of 32. I knew 1/6 had to be a spiral, and that would be 4 squares. And then 2/5 of what's remaining would result in 8 more squares. And you can see down below, I'm left with 12 squares. So it's too much. 32 didn't work. But 12 gave me a good head start on what my next grid would look like. 12 ended up being double, because I need 6 blank. 12 is double of what I actually need. So what I ended up doing was I just cut that number in half. So rather than a grid of 32 that gave me 12 blank squares, I'm going to cut 32 in half and create a grid of 16, which should leave me with the 6 blank squares that I need. So 1/4 of 16 is 4 squares. And then 1/6 of what's remaining is 2 more squares. And then 2/5 of what's remaining would be 4 squares. And as you can see, I am left with 6 squares. So 16 is the correct answer. All right, these were tricky ones this week. I hope I could explain through all my discussion here. I hope you understood kind of the methodology behind the answers. The key part to all of this was a good understanding of fractions and understanding that sometimes we need to use equivalent fractions to solve problems. All right, everybody, great job. That's problem of the week number 4 complete. I look forward to next time, problem of the week number 5. Bye-bye.